Okay, thank you, Alan. Good morning, everybody. Yes, as Alan says, I'm the regional rep for Leicestershire and Rutland for the British Trust for Ornithology. I've been that for about a dozen years now, and I got involved with the BTO when I first took on a breeding bird survey myself. So that's how I got involved with them. So, okay. Right, I want to start off with a little bit of history. The early 1990s, some of you may have heard of a survey called the Common Bird Census, which was being run at that time. This survey was highly resource intensive. It required many repeat visits during the breeding season, sometimes up to 30 different visits, because you were mapping all the territories of all the breeding birds that were present, which is a pretty difficult job. Also, it was self-selected plots, so by consequence, it tended to be the more interesting areas that were chosen by bird watchers. The result was that there was very limited coverage. So in 1994, the BTO, the RSPB, and the then JNCC set up the Breeding Bird Survey in the UK. The main differences were that this was on randomly pre-selected 1 kilometre squares, pre-selected by the BTO, using a sampling method to select them. It only required 2 visits per year. All birds, all adult birds, were recorded in distance spans. So basically the end result was that there was much greater uptake and greater coverage, with the key aim of the survey being to produce national trends for those commoner bird species. If we just have a look at the growth of the breeding bird survey in the Leicestershire and Rutland region, initially it was just 21 squares were allocated in 1994, and 11 of those were surveyed in that first year. So these 11 surveyors recorded 50 species on their squares. And the lists actually look quite different to today's lists if you look at the data. So despite this relatively small number of squares being surveyed, corn bunting, cuckoo and tree sparrow were all recorded regularly in those early years. There was no red kites reported in those first years, and only 1 single buzzard was recorded in the first 9 years, which for anybody bird watching today is an amazing statistic. In the late 90s, around 15 squares were being surveyed annually, and then extra squares were allocated to the region in 2004 and again in 2005, as can be seen by the graph. So the blue line is the number of squares in the region, and the orange line is the number of squares being surveyed. So coverage reached a high of nearly 100% in 2006, when 47 out of 48 squares were surveyed. Consequently, more squares were allocated to the region, and it went up to 60 in 2010, remained at that level until 2017, when I requested a further 10 squares. And what was happening was that I was getting requests for squares from East Leicestershire and Rutland and not being able to give anybody any vacant squares. So it's remained at 70 squares to this day, and typically around 40 squares are surveyed every year by about 30 dedicated surveyors. You'll see there's a couple of dips, 2020, which was COVID, and also 2001. For those of you that can remember, foot and mouth disease, when there was no access to the countryside. However, that's not a big impact for the BBS because it's a long-term data set. So what does a BBS square actually look like then? So on the right is a diagram of what might be called an ideal BBS route. It's two 1 kilometre transects divided into 10 200-metre sections sequentially numbered. You walk a line and you record birds in distance bands from where you're standing out to 25 metres, 25 to 100 metres, greater than 100 metres, and there's also a category for recording birds in flight. However, in reality, it's never like that on the ground, is it? This is my square here. I'm lucky to be able to walk out my door and be able to be almost on my route. As you can see, the first section is curved because it follows the footpath, and that means that they're a little bit close at the end, the other sections, but not too bad. And the second section has only got 3 sections in it. If I was setting this square up myself now, I would probably have a section 9 and just allow it to run slightly out of the square, but that's okay. The white line is the route. The little blue line that you might be able to see is a 25-metre distance band, and the blue bubble is that 100-metre distance band. I have a nice mix of habitats on my square, and I've recorded 65 species. Some illuminating data just from my own square, which is from 2004 to date, is that cuckoo was recorded almost annually from 2004 to 2013, but I've only recorded it once since. Buzzards was first recorded in 2009 and then every year since. St Martin wasn't recorded at all until 2014, and then it's annual, and I believe that's to do with the provision of local artificial nest site walls. But BBS isn't about species, and it's certainly not about rarities. Neither does it attempt to state what the absolute population is. Its key aim is detecting population changes in species. And to do this, the current BBS model takes the maximum of the 2 count visits, that's the early and late visits, as the annual measure of relative abundance. And then trends are produced over 3 time periods. So all time, so from the start of the survey to the current date, the last 10 years and the last 5 years. Trends are only published once the threshold for that species is reached. So just a little bit on that. These thresholds, it's once the average number of squares that the species is recorded on over the time period in question reaches either 40 squares for the whole of the UK trend, 30 for the country and regional levels, and 25 for the county level. So I mentioned that because obviously to get to 25 squares as an average, when you may only be recording on 40, means that it's not easy to produce trends for all the species for Leicestershire and Rutland. However, at the regional level, such as East Midlands, currently 58 species have trends produced for them. And these trends, the key output for these trends is for the BTO to use them to inform government and policymakers. Trends are best illustrated as graphs, and here's the trend graph for blackbird for the Leicestershire and Rutland region. The y-axis here is calculated from the highest count totals, but notice that the scale varies for each different species. All have a trend start value of 100 in 1994. The black dots are the annual counts, the green line is the statistically smooth trend, and the green band is the upper and lower 95% confidence levels. You have to treat trends at a local level prior to 2020 with caution. Sorry, prior to 2012 with caution, though, because of not enough squares being covered up until that point. So now you've got to wake up because this is your turn. I'm going to show you some trends, and you can have a go at naming the species. There'll be 6 trends displayed, and I'll give you about 15 to 20 seconds to consider each one, and you to come up with your own thoughts on it. So this is the first one. This is a resident species that's probably taken advantage of garden feeding stations. And also it's worth saying that it doesn't rely upon insect data, certainly not for feeding its young. Okay, so that's actually a trend graph for wood pigeon, which, as you can see, has pretty much increased quite dramatically and remains at the increased level over the period. So this is a common resident, and it's typically affected by harsh winters. Okay, so that is the wren. So widely recorded, but as you can see, there's a couple of really big, 2 or 3 significant dips, but the average trend is increasing. So now I'm going to give you 2 summer visiting warblers with rather different fortunes in our area. So this is the first one. That is the chiffchaff. So quite a remarkable steady increase. And this is another warbler. Note the trends from the East Midlands, not Leicestershire and Rutland, as there wasn't enough data from Leicestershire and Rutland anymore. That is the willow warbler. So a gradual decline, certainly a decline in our Leicestershire and Rutland region, mirrored at the East Midlands level. Interestingly, the trend for England as a whole is down, but the trend for Scotland is quite significantly up. So if you look at a national trend, it doesn't look like willow warbler is changing very much, but that's probably an indication of climate change in the south not suiting it. Next are 2 finches with quite differing fortunes. So this is the first one. Now that is the goldfinch. So relatively steep increase, certainly since the mid-2000s. Very probably fueled by garden feeding. And here's the second finch. And that is the chaffinch. So I was quite surprised by this graph myself, actually, because I feel like chaffinch has declined gradually and steadily, but it would appear more like locally anyway, its numbers have kind of fallen off of a cliff in the last 10 years. So a few sort of closing thoughts to leave you with. I think one of the key things is the BBS is systematic and it's repeatable. So if I was to be unable to carry out my survey next year, somebody could take it on, reading the instructions, could just do it and would hopefully get a pretty similar set of results to myself. It's not observer biased. So remember the information about the cuckoo. I mean, would anybody starting bird watching now believe you that if you said that cuckoo was a widespread and common species? I've written 25 years ago here, but actually looking at some of the information, even 15 years ago, it was quite widely reported. Now, what I mean by not being observer biased is that because cuckoo is so unusual in the counties, it tends to be recorded by bird watchers because it's notable. Whereas 25 years ago, if it was common, it perhaps wasn't recorded as much. So BBS provides the hard evidence for these changes. BBS is a key tool in setting the UK Birds of Conservation Concern traffic light system, the red, amber, green traffic light system, which you're perhaps aware of. And if you want to see any reports, all these trends are available on the the BTO's website. And there's an annual report produced that each surveyor gets, but they're all available online, and there is a link there. So the information is all freely available. And again, as other speakers have said, if you put in a request for data to BTO, they're always willing to provide you information. So if this talk's sparked your interest in doing a breeding bird survey location, if you can identify most of the commoner birds by sight and sound, then please do get in touch with me, see whether there's a free location near to you. And there's my email address. Okay, thank you very much.